Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about some multi-role aircraft, the jack-of-all-trades Swiss Army knife planes. For rather obvious reasons, having a plane that can perform several different roles sufficiently would be a great benefit to any military or air force. Have it serve as a dive bomber today, a fighter tomorrow, and a level bomber the next. These kind of aircraft are generally most valuable on carriers where space is inherently limited and you can only carry so many planes, so it makes perfect sense to carry planes that can do more than one thing. Now, with these kind of planes, they often aren't exactly great in all of their potential roles, like a literal Swiss Army knife that has a decent blade and a decent set of, screwdriver bits, and a decent corkscrew. It isn't necessarily as good as just a dedicated knife or a screwdriver set, or a corkscrew on its own. Jack of all trades, master of none. When it comes to the early days of aviation, effectively before the advent of jet propulsion, multi-role aircraft were pretty few and far between. This is generally due to the stark contrast in what ground attackers, fighters, and bombers would need, and the comparative lower power of propeller engines when compared to what we have today. A bomber would be a 2 to 4 to 6 engine deal, with a very large frame and a bomb bay to carry thousands of pounds of explosives. On the other end of the spectrum, for fighters, that's a 1, maybe 2 engine deal, with a small frame for great speed and maneuverability. Generally speaking, it is very difficult to blend a more sizable frame with multiple engines with the speed and maneuverability of a smaller single-engine fighter. You generally had one or the other, not both. But there were certainly exceptions to that rule, with twin-engine fighters and fighter-bombers like the P-38 Lightning and de Havilland Mosquito and Hornet being some of the closer planes that the world had to true multi-role aircraft at that time. But there was one plane in World War II that would reign supreme as the most versatile and multi-role of them all. A plane that was about a decade old by the end of the war that could be outfitted to serve in just about any role that they needed it to. Whether it was dive bomber, level bomber, torpedo bomber, night fighter, heavy fighter, ground attacker, or recon, whatever you wanted it to do, it could do. This is Germany's do-it-all aircraft. This is the Junkers Ju-88. The story of this key piece of the German Luftwaffe begins all the way back in August 1935 as part of a design request from the Reich Air Ministry for a new schnellbomber design, a bomber that would use its speed as its defense. And what they requested was an effectively unarmed three-seat bomber that could hit speeds upwards of 298 miles an hour with a payload between 500 and 1,000 kilos. Not a significant payload by any stretch, but that was not the intent of this design. To this request, Junkers, and more specifically W. H. Evers and Alfred Gassner, two Germans who had been working and studying aviation over in America, would submit a design for a slimmer twin-engine monoplane, powered by two Daimler-Benz DB600s, with around 900 horsepower apiece. Their design was accepted sometime in late 1935 or early 1936, and Junkers was cleared to produce at least 5 prototypes, with the latter 3 being outfitted with UMO 211 engines. Junkers was ordered to complete the first prototype in just 9 months. While they wouldn't achieve that, they were pretty close, and the first Ju-88 prototype would take to the air in December 1936. The V-1 prototype looked a lot closer to the American Douglas A-26 Invader than the eventual production model Ju-88, with a mostly solid nose, with a glass underside for the bombardier, and a cockpit canopy that sat just about flush with the rest of the fuselage. There was very clear consideration for aerodynamics and overall top speed. Powering it at this time was indeed 2 DB600 engines, with a slightly different setup to it that made them appear to be radial engines when in fact they were inline engines. They were equipped with annular radiators that effectively turned them into radial engines. This was likely done to save some space elsewhere on the design that would have to have the liquid cooling system installed, sort of sacrifice the drag at the engine nacelles to save drag elsewhere. The performance of the V1 seems to be a bit spotty, as it crashed and was lost not too long after its first flight, but generally speaking, the overall results were considered to be promising, although the engines were underpowered. The V2 and V3 would take to the air a few months later, and the V3, first flown in September 1937, and outfitted with the UMO 211 engines with around 1,000 horsepower, stood out with its significant boost in speed, and it would achieve a top speed upwards of 323 miles an hour, a speed that was absolutely remarkable for a plane its size. Because of this, the German government decided to put one of the prototypes aside for a little propaganda campaign. The V5 model would have its design altered very slightly to make the cockpit more aerodynamic, and it would be outfitted with stronger versions of the UMO 211 engines, with around 1,200 horsepower apiece. Then, in March 1939, while work on the more conventional design was progressing in the foreground, the V5 would end up setting a speed record for a 1,000-kilometer course carrying a 2,000-kilo payload, averaging a speed of 321 miles an hour. Now, to be clear, this was not indicative of the performance of the production model Ju-88s. This was purely for propaganda, to show the world that they had this super fast and scary bomber. So while the propaganda campaign was going on, in the actual combat design of the Ju-88, the production model design would begin to emerge. In the V4 model, the first so-called beetle's eye nose and taller canopy would be seen. This was basically a fully glass nose made of small panels that would offer excellent vision for the bombardier and other crew members. Additionally, in the V3, 4, and 5, rear-facing defensive armament would be added as well, just a handful of 7.7 or 7.92mm machine guns. In the V6 model, the landing gear would be altered to make it slightly more compact, going from 2 legs or struts on each wheel to just a single strut or leg, and the wheel could swivel 90 degrees. A very small but still interesting change nonetheless. A much larger design decision, though, was to begin testing some of the prototypes with dive brakes to turn the Ju-88 into a dive bomber. Under the orders of Ernst Udet, the Ju-88 was to be capable of dive bombing. While this seems kind of insane for a bomber, when equipped with these dive brakes, the 88 prototypes were capable of doing it. But there was a catch. Possibly due to the thinner frame and it being a bomber, the pull-up from the dive would put incredible stress on the frame, and later on in production, the planes that were outfitted with the dive brakes were given very strict restrictions on how steep they should dive or what maneuvers they should perform, to ensure that the plane didn't just break apart mid-air. Now, is this a necessary addition to the 88 design? Well, no, of course not, but it could do it, so why not, I guess. Still in the prototype phase, the Ju-88 was now a bomber, dive bomber, and also technically a torpedo bomber, as that kind of fit in with the former two. With the V7 prototype, it would venture into being a heavy fighter. For this prototype, the glass nose would be swapped out with a fully metal one, and 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.9mm machine guns would be installed. With the tests of the prototypes proving to be successful, the 88 was intended to begin production sometime in 1938, and rather optimistic projections from Luftwaffe leadership envisioned a monthly production even early on of 300 planes per month, basically 10 planes per day, 3,600 per year. While certainly bold, the Ju-88's construction method would help in achieving this goal. The 88's fuselage was constructed in two separate halves. One group would work on the internals and externals of one of the halves, and the other group would work on the other. This allowed them to basically construct the fuselage in half the time, finishing both internal and external work simultaneously. Once the two halves were both completed, they could just be bolted together, and ta-da, you have a fuselage. The rest of the construction was largely the same, but cutting down on the fuselage construction time would be a massive boost. So early in 1939, the first 10 pre-production models, dubbed the A0, would be delivered for testing, and ideally with the faster construction method and the anticipated goal of 300 per month. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Germany would possibly have hundreds or even thousands of 88s flying over Poland. Or at the very least, that was the dream. In reality, by that time, there were just a grand total of 12 production model Ju-88A1s, none of which would make any kind of impact in Poland. So how exactly did Junkers fall several hundred or 1,000 models short here? Largely, it was caused by factors that were out of their control. For the production of the 88, Junkers and their numerous smaller factories and companies that were enlisted to participate in their construction, they needed a lot of metal, engines, tools, and workers, and a lot of that was regulated and being doled out by the German government. As a result, early on in the 88 project, when it was of lower priority, Junkers was suffering from severe shortages of basically everything that they needed to make these planes. This problem was well known even before full-scale production of the 88 began, which led to the director of Junkers, Heinrich Koppenberg, receiving an order from Hermann Göring that Koppenberg was now effectively the sole leader of the 88 project. He would control all of the factories and sub-factories and subcontractors that were part of the project, in an effort to sort of cut through the red tape, as it were, and forcefully ramp up production. Of course, this didn't immediately work, as evidenced by the 12 available planes at the start of the war, but as Germany started gaining territory, both pre- and post-start of the war, they would gain resources and factories and people that they could force into labor. These territorial additions would help boost production eventually as things ramped up and the production lines were set, but at least for the start of the war, production was very slow. But the production would not stay slow for very long, and by the end of 1940, some 2,000 Ju-88s had been produced and delivered, 1,800 of them being bombers, likely mostly the A1 model, along with some 300 recon planes and a few dozen converted heavy fighter C variant planes. As production in this time would follow a more exponential curve, the Ju-88s didn't see that much action in France, but they would perform decently well when they were there, and they also suffered a good number of losses due to accidents. Pilots weren't terribly familiar with the plane just yet, and the Ju-88 handled much lighter than bombers like the HE-111, which led to some growing pains and some crashes. It really wouldn't be until the Battle of Britain that the Ju-88 would see its first major run, and what an overall disappointing run it was. But to be fair, all German bombers had a very disappointing run in the Battle of Britain. Ideally, with the more schnellbomber-esque design of the Ju-88, it could just outrun enemy fighters, and thus its more modest defensive armaments of just a handful of machine guns were fine. In reality, though, this was certainly not the case, and all manner of bomber would suffer heavy losses in the Battle of Britain, with over 388 being lost alone. This sort of helped the Luftwaffe snap back to reality and deal with the gravity of the fact that the schnellbomber concept wasn't really working. Through the various prototypes and the addition of dive brakes, and bombs, and pilots, and equipment, and whatnot, the top speed of the Ju-88 had decreased. Perhaps if it could hit 321 miles an hour, like the V5 could, things would have been different. But as they stood, the early 88s over Britain only had a top speed of 280 miles an hour, which was well within the speed of enemy Spitfires and Hurricanes. With this wake-up call, Junkers would go about improving the Ju-88, and the model they ended up with, the A4 model, would end up being the effective basis for the rest of the models going forward. Measuring in at 14.4 meters long, 20 meters wide, and 2.8 meters tall, the eventual main model Ju-88's wingspan was extended by about 2 meters, from about 18 meters pre-A4 model up to the 20 meters it was now at. Additionally, they would also acknowledge the fact that the 88, despite being pretty fast for a bomber, would not be outrunning enemy fighters, and additional armor all around would be added, along with a enhanced defensive armament all around as well. Instead of just a couple 7.92mm machine guns, at minimum there would be 5 total machine guns, 2 forward firing in the nose, 2 firing to the rear at the back of the canopy, and 1 firing in the ventral position. More guns could be added, and the guns could be swapped out with larger caliber 13mm or perhaps even 20mm guns if so desired, giving it greater defensive power. While this overall defensive setup paled in comparison to some larger, not Schnellbomber-esque designs, the Ju-88 did offer a pretty solid combination of good speed and decent defensive weaponry. Despite the plane's slimmer frame and still relatively lower power UMO 211 engines with around 1,200 horsepower each, the Ju-88A4 could carry a maximum of 6,600 pounds of explosives. Up to 4,000 pounds could be carried externally on 4 underwing hardpoints, and the remaining weight could be held in the internal bomb bay. If it was flying with the maximum bomb load, though, the plane would have to be outfitted with rocket boosters to aid in takeoff, and overall the extra sources of drag on the outside of the plane from the bombs would end up reducing performance quite significantly. Still though, with the greater defensive capabilities of the A4, along with the other Ju-88 variants that were being developed in parallel, in the 88C class of heavy fighters and night fighters, and the 88D class of reconnaissance aircraft, and as German pilots and squadrons grew more accustomed to the plane, and the war expanded out to the Balkans, Mediterranean, Africa, and Eastern Europe, the 88 in its variety of roles would serve very well. It would be quite difficult for me to list out everything that the 88 would end up doing in its career, largely because as resources were allocated to the program and production was accelerated, several thousand would be made per year until the war ended, serving as a level bomber, a dive bomber, a torpedo bomber, a recon plane, a ground attacker, a heavy fighter, and night fighter. The Ju-88 would be involved in just about every facet of the Luftwaffe. If Germany attacked from the air, there was a great chance that the Ju-88 was involved. So instead of talking about everything that the 88 did in combat, I'll instead talk about a couple later variants and improvements, and the eventual decline of the 88. In the more immediate sense, in 1942, Germany knew that the A models, despite still serving pretty well, would need some kind of an upgrade in their engines, which led to the UMO 211 engines being replaced with stronger variants in the 211J that had about 200 more horsepower apiece. However, this didn't seem to correlate to a major boost in top speed, as the new engines were a bit heavier. But still, the top speed of the A4 model with these engines sat at around 290 miles an hour. Still, as the war pressed into 1943, the A models of all sorts would see dwindling success, as enemy fighters improved and German offensive capabilities overall would diminish, which necessitated the start of a new, faster model in the Ju-88S. These models would swap in stronger BMW 801 radial engines, with over 1,700 horsepower apiece. These new engines, along with a reduction in the defensive armament again, back down to just a few guns, but 13mm machine guns now, this would greatly improve the top speed up to 332 miles an hour. And if it had a nitrous boost, that speed would hit 379 miles an hour. The overall peak of the S line of planes, the S2 and S3, would use even stronger UMO 213 engines, with over 2,000 horsepower apiece, which would end up boosting the top speed just a bit up to 382 miles an hour. However, due to the gradually deteriorating war situation into 1944 and 45, very few Ju-88Ss were made, and their overall impact was negligible. For something that had an actual impact, we have the Ju-88G models, which were specifically designed night fighters. Originally, some of the Ju-88C heavy fighters would just have some radar slapped on, and that was that. They were night fighters now. But on the G model, they had an actual unique design. As was rather common with night fighters, the greatest change from the C to the G would be the armament, in it having a slight upward tilt, and also the tail section would be enlarged for greater stability. They would be attacking enemy bombers that were above them, so giving the guns a slight upward tilt made perfect sense. Armed with 420mm cannons, the Ju-88Gs would serve very well in destroying British and American bombers flying over Germany. But once again, as the war pressed on and Germany lost ground and manpower, and Allied equipment improved, the 88G would see its effectiveness reduce. The last variant that I want to talk about was a very minor one, but it was still interesting nonetheless, and that was the Ju-88P series that would appear around mid-war, wanting a pure ground attacker and tank destroyer for their combat against the Soviets. Some of the 88C models would be taken and outfitted with much larger guns. The first of which, the P1, would see the addition of a 75mm cannon under fuselage. This was quite similar to the Henschel HS-129 and its tank buster variant, but the Ju-88 had a little more going for it in that it was a more robust design with stronger engines, so it would likely be able to stand the intense recoil of the gun much better. While the gun was certainly powerful in the field, and testing showed that the 88 frame was able to handle that power, there was at least one problem in how they reduced the recoil. The muzzle brake that they would install would push some of the expelled gases to the side, and this ended up interfering with the engines and their performance. This, along with the 75mm cannon being generally unwieldy, led to it being replaced with two 37mm cannons on some versions and a 50mm cannon on others. Overall, though, perhaps just a few dozen of the P-series planes were ever made, and their overall impact was minimal. Despite the overall effectiveness of the Ju-88 dwindling by the end of the war due to just the greater war situation, the Ju-88 as a whole was one of the most important planes of the war. being Germany's third most produced plane behind the FW-190 and Bf-109, and it was far and away their most produced bomber, with just under 15,000 of them being made, which was quite impressive considering that at the start of the war, just about 12 of them existed. Germany invested heavily in it, and because it could be converted to do basically anything, it is not difficult to see why. Realistically, the biggest problem that the Ju-88 had in the end was Germany losing air superiority and starting to lose the war, meaning that less and less could be invested in upgrading it. They did attempt to make new and improved versions with the Ju-188, 288, and 388, but aside from the 188 and its roughly 1,000 strong production run, these would amount to very little. The Ju-88 overall certainly proves the utility of a Swiss Army knife, but that knife kind of loses its utility when your opponent brings his friends and they all have guns. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. As I was recording this video, I was watching the Orioles and Astros game, and the Orioles were losing 14-3 and somehow almost tied it up, and still lost 14-11. I mean, you can't win them all, but they almost came back and tied it, so good job, team. We'll move on to the next one. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.